As I've come to get to know my personal style more and more over the years and looked at my outfits with an increasingly analytical and detailed eye, I have realized that wearing and mixing patterns is a core element of my style. My outfits pretty much always need at least one pattern, and sometimes one isn't even enough and they actually need 2 or 3. And as I've continued to share my style on YouTube, I've had a lot of people ask me about how I mix patterns and choose how to style different patterns together, which I am so honored people are interested in hearing about from me. So honestly, this video has been brewing for months. I have spent so long considering what exactly makes a pattern mixing combo work for me in an outfit. And today, I'm sharing all my pattern mixing secrets. They're not really secrets. They're just things I didn't even fully realize I was doing until I really thought about it very intentionally. And I'm so excited to lay them all out now. I also have to note the majority of my own fabulous favorite patterned clothing I got secondhand. It is one of the best ways to find unique gems and quality classics at the most affordable price and obviously more sustainably. And I even just got some new patterned items that I'm so excited to style from ThredUp, the sponsor of today's video. If you don't already know, ThredUp is a huge online thrift and consignment shop. Their selection is expansive. And ThredUp particularly makes secondhand shopping so easy because you can search and filter by size, color, style, fabric, brand, and more to find exactly what you want to suit your style and preferences. Okay, let me show you these patterned items that I'm so excited about. First up, this incredible, voluminous, flowy blouse. I mean, this silhouette, this movement, this pattern, this fabric, this top is so magical to me. It is Calypso Sembat, and the estimated retail price is $295, but on ThredUp, it was $25.50. We also have something a little more classic, but also playful. This red and white striped button down. If you watch my videos, you will recognize this blue and white striped button down. I wear it constantly, so I've been meaning to get a red version. And this is originally Gap. The estimated retail price is $69.95, but on ThredUp, it was $7. When pattern mixing, I also love to incorporate a solid piece into the outfit to balance out the patterns. And I think this little ruffly mini skirt will be absolutely perfect for that. This skirt is originally Ann Taylor Loft, and the estimated retail price is $79.95, but on ThredUp, it was $17.60. I have also been going kind of hard in the ThredUp favorites lately. I have saved so many fun, beautiful pieces in there. So if you're interested to shop hundreds of brands for a fraction of the price all in one place, you can click my link below and use code BEAT50 to shop those ThredUp faves and receive 50% off your first order plus free shipping. All right, now let's get into our pattern mixing 101. First, let's talk about which patterns I think do and don't work together. For me, the underlying key to pretty much all pattern mixing that determines when it works and when it doesn't is whether the pattern pieces blend together or still feel separate. I think when they start to blend into each other, it sort of confuses the eye and makes it harder to tell where one piece or pattern ends and another begins, which makes the outfit feel overwhelming and visually confusing. It's kind of like how a pack of zebras together is confusing to the eye of a predator. It makes it harder to distinguish one zebra from another. It's kind of disorienting. I feel like similar patterns blending together does the same thing. It makes the outfit a little harder to make sense of. And to me, when pieces blend together, that can also make it look like you were trying to coordinate and match, but it's just not quite succeeding, which I think can also make an outfit look a little less intentional and more like visually cacophonous or discordant. Conversely, when it's easier to distinguish separate items, separate shapes in your outfit, it's easier to make sense of visually. There's a clear path for the eye to follow, there are clearer boundaries, which makes it feel harmonious rather than confusing or stressful to look at. And for the record, if you want to make like confusing, sort of visually disorienting outfits on purpose, for the sake of artistic statement, more power to you. I support you. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to try to describe what works and what doesn't from the point of view of what feels visually harmonious versus visually cluttered and confusing, just because I think this is what people are typically looking for when it comes to pattern mixing. But I just want to say, if you're already on that next level and you love mixing patterns in a way that's like confusing and disorienting as an intentional choice, I truly love that. I'm a big supporter of fashion that rebels against convention. There's not really a right or wrong way to do this. All that said, when you're going for a harmonious pattern mixing look that avoids feeling cluttered or visually overwhelming, I think the easiest patterns to mix are generally patterns with lower visual contrast and less busyness. And specifically, patterns tend to have lower visual contrast when they are smaller, simpler, have lower contrast colors within the pattern, and have fewer colors overall. All these traits allow these patterns to function almost like solids in an outfit because they tend to maintain a pretty unified field of color across the garment that still has like a clear, start and end. I think what I'm wearing right now hopefully exemplifies this pretty well. And because of that, these sorts of patterns are very easy to mix with each other and also with, bigger or bolder or more colorful or more ornate patterns. On the other hand, the harder patterns to mix are those ones with a higher visual contrast or busyness. These patterns tend to be larger, more complex, have higher contrast within them, and also just have more colors overall. I might mix this sort of pattern with a much subtler, lower contrast pattern. And in fact, sometimes that can actually make a bigger, bolder pattern feel subtler because it removes it from being the only point of interest in an outfit, balances out with more detail somewhere else. That's like an unaffected side effect of pattern mixing. It can actually make both patterns feel a little more subdued and less statement making than either pattern might feel on its own because they don't stand out as much in the outfit. But I would also almost never mix multiple big, bold, colorful, high contrast patterns together because I just find that they bleed into each other in a way that looks quite chaotic and unharmonious to me. Of course, patterns are a huge spectrum, and most patterns will fall somewhere in between a super small, linear, single color, low contrast pattern and a large, ornate, high contrast, super colorful pattern. I mean, like right here, I think these two patterns work together because while this is busy, it's very low contrast, so it feels more like a unified visual field. And then this is a little more high contrast, but the pattern's also so small and simple, it's not overwhelming. Plus, these two patterns contrast a lot from each other, which I also think visually separates them very clearly, which makes them work without being confusing and overwhelming. There are so many different iterations. There's really endless possibilities of the nuances of specific individual patterns. So it's really up to you to use your own personal discretion on how those patterns are operating in play with one another. Alas, there is no eternal truth that like plaid always works with polka dots, but never with florals. I think it really depends on the specific plaid or polka dot or floral that you're working with. So I hope considering these qualities of size, shape, contrast, and color palette can at least help you get started, be a useful framework to sort of analyze different patterns and how they might play off each other. And it might also help you put words to why certain combinations do or don't work for you in your wardrobe and how you can then apply that knowledge to potential new combinations. I also want to talk a little more specifically about color and how that affects which patterns work together, because that's one of the most important factors to me. I feel like something I have heard people say so many times when it comes to pattern mixing is to choose patterns that have similar color palettes. But I just completely disagree with that. For me, color palettes that are too similar is actually one of like the number one things that will prevent me from pairing two patterns together. Because like I said earlier, similar color palettes do two things I do not like. One, it causes the pieces to blend into each other. There's not enough contrast between them. And two, it also always ends up looking like I tried to match them, but I failed because it's always a little bit off. It's definitely not that the patterns can't have any colors in common. Like right now, this jacket has a bit of blue in it. This shirt's dominant color is blue. But I would pair two patterns together that have a different dominant color in the color scheme. Like even though these have a shared color, the dominant color is different, red versus blue. Generally, in my outfits, I always just try to look to the dominant color in one pattern and then pair that with a different pattern that has a different dominant color that looks good or works well with the dominant color of the first pattern. I hope that makes sense. I will say, I do think two patterns with the same dominant color can work well if they're different shades of that color. So like light blue and navy, for example. As long as the two colors and therefore the two patterns still clearly contrast from each other, I do think a monochrome pattern mixing moment can look really nice and work well. I just, again, gotta keep the patterns from bleeding into each other. There needs to be a clear separation, clear boundaries in the outfit. And if a pattern is so colorful it doesn't have a dominant color jumping out, I would personally only use that for pattern mixing if the other pattern has a super limited color palette, ideally almost a monochrome within the pattern. All right, now that we know which patterns tend to be easier to mix in general, what's easier to mix together, let's get into how you might apply that. If I want to start pattern mixing in my own wardrobe, how do I put it together? in a full actual outfit. We're gonna start small and subtle, okay? For people who maybe want to dip a toe into pattern mixing but find it a little intimidating. These are some ways to start that still look very natural and integrated and not super busy in your outfits. My first tip is to start with one patterned clothing item and one patterned accessory. Ideally, pieces that are not next to each other in the outfit. So like a patterned skirt and a patterned bag, or maybe patterned pants and a patterned hair accessory. I think this works so well as an introduction to pattern mixing for a couple of reasons. Firstly, like I said, the pieces are not touching each other. So they're both in the outfit, but there's that built-in separation that will keep them from blending together. Secondly, by having one of the patterns be an accessory, that also constrains that pattern to a smaller surface area. So it's not as visually present, it feels a little subtler. And thirdly, having one of the patterns be on an accessory also forces one of the clothing items to be solid, which breaks up those patterns and gives the eye a clear, solid place to rest that also takes up more space and really anchors the outfit. This is actually one of the most common ways that I mix patterns. Very frequently, when just one pattern clothing item doesn't feel like enough, I'll add on a patterned accessory to really complete the look with more depth and dimension and interest. My next tip, sort of a step up, is to mix two patterned clothing items together, but then to break them up by also adding solids to the outfit. The more solids you add, the more it neutralizes the pattern. It shifts the proportions of the outfit to have a higher proportion of solids versus patterns. And it just, again, gives the eye like more restful, solid surface area to ground the outfit and balance those areas of more visual interest. If you're feeling like you want the pattern mix to be extra subtle, you could use a solid piece specifically to visually separate the two patterns. So let's say you have a pattern top and bottom, you could use a neutral vest to break it up. So the patterns still occupy a lot of space in the outfit, but they're not directly next to each other. Or if you want something a little bolder and more playful, you can definitely also have those patterns next to each other, but then just add something like a solid jacket or cardigan on top. Solid accessories can also help here, especially if they're coordinated. I'm not always one to like coordinate my shoes and my bag and my hat or whatever, because I love like a mismatched eclecticism. But if it's an outfit that's already feeling quite mismatched and eclectic with the clothing pieces, bringing in that more matchy element can really do wonders to make the outfit feel so much more cohesive. Another sort of entry-level pattern mixing option is to specifically use monochrome patterns, or items whose pattern actually exists more through its texture, like a checkerboard stitch knitting pattern, or maybe lace, or croc embossed leather. To me, these still count as patterns, but they feel super subtle, super natural. They add that like richness and interest and depth and dimension, but they're also so versatile. So these are so great to mix without even needing any solids to ground the outfit. And you can really easily mix these together or with virtually any other pattern. Like I said, they're very versatile. I feel like even the boldest, loudest patterned skirt could look so great with just like a lace top and not even need any other grounding elements. Similarly, if you're just starting out, I also think an easy entry point is to pair together two of those smaller, lower contrast, less multicolor patterns that again can read almost like solids in an outfit. You definitely don't have to start with your boldest patterns. I think it's much easier and more approachable to start with the subtler ones. Another really great pattern to start with, if you can even call it a pattern, is patchwork, particularly patchwork that uses patterned fabrics, because in that case, it's already starting the pattern mixing for you. It's already built into the outfit. It already makes that mixture of patterns look intentional. So I sometimes find it easier and less intimidating to build from there. I realize this tip is sort of specific because not everybody already has like a multi-pattern patchwork item in their wardrobe. But if you happen to, this tip is for you. Try adding another pattern in there. I also really love using items with graphics on them in my outfits. And these aren't really the same thing as patterns, but they add a similar heightened level of detail and visual interest. So if you're looking for ways to execute that more eclectic, detailed, visually interesting look, I would also encourage you to try mixing in graphics, like a pattern skirt with a graphic tee or sweater, or a patterned blouse with a graphic tote bag or something. Even ornate jewelry with different textures or shapes or colors, even beads with patterns on them, can create a similar sense of graphic interest. So I love to mix those with patterns as well. Or you could even do a pattern mix and then also add a graphic element. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. That brings us to our next section. How do I go bolder? Okay, Liz, you might be saying, I've got the entry-level pattern mixing down. What if I want to go even bolder and get even more creative and experimental with it? That's amazing. This is me talking back. You said that. You were like, hey, Liz, and you said that, and now this is me saying, That's amazing. I love that. I have some ideas. Firstly, of course, you can just start using bigger, bolder patterns. Of course, you could also incorporate that into some of the earlier ideas, but a lot of those also involved using subtle patterns, aiming for subtlety. So if you're trying to go a little bolder and more playful, I think that is the perfect time to get a bigger or bolder or more colorful pattern in the mix. And you could pair that big, bold pattern with one of those smaller, lower contrast, subtler patterns. Or you could even try pairing two slightly bolder patterns together. Maybe not at like the maximum end of the boldness spectrum, but a little further along it, you know? Maybe breaking them up with a solid piece if needed, or going for two bolder patterns that are still clearly very distinct from each other in size or color or level of detail, etc. I also think just using patterns with more vibrant colors in them can create a bolder look that feels more creative, even if the patterns aren't specifically bolder or like more multicolored. Just the fact that they are brightly saturated can add a lot. I also think two variations of the same pattern can be extra fun and playful, like two different stripes or two different plaids paired together. This can be a little harder to pull off because, again, I try to avoid having the patterns like blend together too much or look like I was trying to match and I failed. But if you can choose the right colors and sizes to pair together, it can create such a funky, playful sort of artful mirroring or repetition that I think can read more editorial in a way that's really fun. And I mean, even this can be done a little more subtly, like with the really chunky stripe and then a little thinner stripe. And then if you wanted to look a little bolder or more playful, maybe switch that tiny stripe to a slightly thicker stripe. Because again, it's really not about the pattern you're using, like the fact that it's stripes versus plaid versus florals or whatever else. It's about the specific characteristics of the specific versions of those patterns that you're working with. You also definitely do not have to stop at two patterns in your pattern mixing outfit. Coordinating 3 or more is totally possible and can be such a fun challenge. I think it's great if they have variety, again, in size, value, contrast, complexity, etc. Like bringing in one lighter, smaller pattern, and then one more medium size, medium value pattern, and then one larger, darker pattern. Again, I'm always just trying to maintain contrast between all the patterns. So if I can still do that, even with 3 patterns, I think it still works. I also think, again, having a solid or 2 also mixed into that outfit can provide that grounding element. So I might do like a patterned vest, jacket, and bottoms. But then if I have a solid shirt under the vest, and a solid bag and shoes, that can still look balanced, harmonious, and grounded, while also being super unexpected and creative. I also think the subtler your patterns are, the more of them you can mix together. So another fun pattern mixing challenge might be to try seeing how many different subtle patterns you can combine in one outfit. Again, subtlety typically being small, low contrast, simpler, and less color variation. And in that case, if you have a bunch of those subtler patterns, some patterns also might even be able to function visually like solids, in which case you might not even really need real solids in the outfit. It could just be 5 subtle patterns stacked together. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you can definitely also get graphics into the mix. A graphic doesn't just work with one pattern. You can definitely also use a graphic tee or a graphic tote bag in an outfit that already has pattern mixing going on. And again, that can be a great way to add even more visual interest and eclecticism without an overwhelming combination of patterns. I also think it helps me to be a little bolder and freer with my pattern mixing and styling choices in general. When I think of pattern mixing and my outfits, not just in the narrow terms of like what's considered stylish or like what's on trend or what's the cool girl look right now. And instead think of pattern mixing and my outfits as like an art form, as though I'm creating a patchwork quilt or a painting. I find that rich variety and detail so beautiful in other art forms, and there's really no reason not to extend that to style and clothing. Truly, I think a lot of people have this deep-seated conditioning to think patterns next to each other just looks wrong in an outfit specifically. But in so many other environments and art forms, we accept it much more open-mindedly. Like if you look at historical art or traditional clothing from around the world, interiors across centuries, you can see that people everywhere, all over this whole earth, have been creating and combining all sorts of different patterns and motifs throughout human history and finding so much beauty in that combination of pattern throughout human history. And I love to think of my own outfits as like just another extension of the whole history of human culture and beauty and tradition and creativity. It just makes outfits feel so much more special and creative, and it allows them to reach so far beyond the bounds of like typical and acceptable fashion in 21st century America, you know? Like when you look at clothing in the context of all in which you live and all that came before you, it just makes pattern mixing seem like a much smaller deal, doesn't it? Historical art and interiors and traditional clothing can also provide such lush, exciting inspiration for contemporary fashion and outfits, especially pattern mixing. Honest to God, one great way to get style inspiration in general, and specifically for pattern mixing, is to go to an art museum. Modern art too. I know I've been talking about historical art more because that's just where I've happened to have drawn more of my inspiration, but the pattern mixing and the beauty of art and creativity is everywhere, all around us all the time, and we just have to tap into it and connect with it to give ourselves so much creativity and also just more fulfillment in life. Really, looking at any other visually creative spheres beyond specifically fashion can kind of help you realize that a lot of the stuff we think of as like looking good in fashion is kind of arbitrary and incredibly narrow and just doesn't apply to other visual art forms. So why do we need to apply it to style and fashion? You know what I mean? Outfits can be anything, and don't you forget that. All right, well, that was a bit of a side tangent. But with that, I think I've covered all the information I have that I think is useful for an introduction to pattern mixing. This is, of course, really just a jumping off point. You can get even more creative and bold and playful and colorful from here. But I hope this video can be a useful starting point to try out some pattern mixing, or maybe just try pattern mixing in a new way that you hadn't done before. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to check out my ThredUp faves through the link below, and let me know in the comments what pattern mixing idea from this video you are most interested in trying. Oh, and if you do leave a comment, watch another video, like maybe this one right here, and subscribe to my channel. I heard your life will start to have a pattern of success and good fortune and nothing bad, only good patterns from here on out in all of our lives. That's what I heard. I can't confirm, but that's what I heard would happen.